Hello, this is going to be the third and final section of the history of the vertebrates as an introduction primarily to students who are studying comparative vertebrate anatomy to serve as the backdrop for future topics on the different organ systems. And I'd like to pick up two groups from the last video, the birds and the mammals, and then study what they accomplished in the last 65 million years, which is known as the Cenozoic era. Well, birds are unique today. And when I ask my students here, can you identify this as a bird or not? They always get it right. Yes, that's a bird. Well, how do you know? Well, birds have wings. That makes it easy today. But if you were to consider fossil animals, including some of the theropod dinosaurs, it gets much harder. Because if you were to say, all right, well, let's anatomically look at the bones of a bird wing and of a dinosaur hand, you realize, wow, it's really hard to distinguish between the two. The wing would be a little longer and thinner, but other than that, all of the bones are the same. The shapes of the bones, like this semicircular carpal bone, they are the same. And this is because birds evolved from one group of theropod dinosaurs. Not only did they have the same bones in their arms as birds have in their wings, some also brooded over their eggs the way birds do. Some had fused clavicles or wish bones, and they had holes in their bones for extensions of the lungs, which is similar to the unique avian system, which is possessed. And they also had feathers. Now, when we look at what birds do today with modern feathers, some of the uses aren't directly involved in flight. So, the color of your skin or the color of your feathers can help you in camouflage against different backgrounds. They could be of use in courtship. They could be of use in keeping warm. So birds and mammals would be endothermic, warm-blooded animals. And so among the adaptations of the meat-eating theropod dinosaurs, there's a number of them which possessed downy feathers, which could be used for keeping warm or for camouflage or courtship. But then there were also some which possessed what we call flight feathers. Now, there were dinosaurs which had flight feathers on their arms, their legs, and their tail, but we don't think that they could fly. So what were they doing? Well, we don't know. Once again, courtship is a possibility. Maybe some use in prey capture. So if you're grabbing, a little animal and you've got these long feathers on your arms, maybe that forms a little basket that you can use. If you are jumping after your prey, and the fact that some of these had switchblade claws on their feet suggests that the feet could be a potential weapon. Obviously, these feathers would prolong a jump, allowing you to glide a bit. They could help you steer in midair. And so feathers and even flight feathers apparently had some sort of adaptive role before they were in birds which could actually fly. There are actually some of the theropod dinosaurs which actually might have been capable of some limited flight or gliding. And so flight might actually have evolved in the dinosaurs a couple of times, one, say, in the ancestor of birds, but then in another in the ancestor of, say, Microraptor or Rahona and others. When birds first appear in the middle of the Jurassic period, they are not the birds of today. There are no sparrows, there are no ducks, there are no herons, there are no hawks. And instead, the birds remind us very much of dinosaurs. They have clawed, grasping fingers. They have a long reptilian tail. They still have teeth in their jaws. So they certainly are a mix of the features which we associate with birds, making them distinguished from any modern reptile. But then they also had a number of dinosaurian features which make them different from any bird that's alive today. So while birds descended from dinosaurs, they did not appear as modern birds um, do at first. And then if we look at the tens of millions of years after the first birds in the Mesozoic era, one can observe um, the bird plan gradually becoming built. So, for example, the most primitive birds had this long reptilian tail. That would be the first thing to change. And then birds would have a reduced tail with fused bones known as a pygostyle. Birds would retain teeth on their jaws and clawed fingers um, for quite some time. The earliest birds probably weren't great flyers because they lacked the prominent keel on their sternum, which allows their chest muscles to come out to here. So, maybe they would have had to have taken off from a run or jumped out of a tree and flapped on their way down in order to take flight. So over tens of millions of years in the Cretaceous period, birds got better. They got better at flying. They modified their thorax. And so there was a group of birds, and it was the Ornithothoraces group, where their thorax develops this prominent keeled sternum. They develop a modification of wing muscles so that a muscle that's down here can actually be pulling the wings upwards from up there. So that's a neat trick. That's the supracoracoideus muscle. So the changes which make birds not just flyers, but good flyers, and flyers which are, say, able to take off from a standstill. These were not present in the first birds. They developed over time. And so when we think of the traits which make a bird, they weren't present in the first birds, many of them, and they developed slowly over time. And there were distinct groups of birds. So once birds get to be good flyers, the major group of birds at the end of the Mesozoic is a group which is completely extinct today. They were called the opposite birds, or the enantiornithine birds. They were widespread throughout the world. They include vulture-sized animals, birds, sparrow-sized birds. Some lost their teeth. But the mass extinction, which wipes out the last of the dinosaurs, wipes out the most common birds of the Cretaceous as well. But this minor group of birds, the euornithine birds, they actually survive the mass extinction. Now, there was some diversity in this group. By the end of the Cretaceous, there were some gull-like forms. There were some flightless diving birds. And so around the end of the Mesozoic era, there was a diversity of these euornithine birds. Not many of these survived into the Cenozoic era. This would be the time after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And of the groups that did, the most primitive birds alive today are largely flightless. They include the ostrich of Africa, the rhea of South America, the emu and cassowary of Australia, the kiwi of New Zealand, but they also include some South American birds which can fly. So this group, the Paleognathus birds, they have a more reptilian orientation of skull bones. That makes them the most primitive birds alive today. And then all other bird lineages then arose in the last 65 million years. So one of the more basal branches would be that which would lead to ducks and chickens and their kin. So the duck group, the chicken group, that is an early branch here. And then as the Cenozoic progressed, then there would be other lineages, such as those of aquatic birds, those of hawks and eagles, woodpeckers, hummingbirds, etc. Songbirds make up the majority of birds today. They're small. and they have a modification of their throat known as the syrinx, which allows them to produce song. But they do not appear until midway through the Cenozoic era. So while they are the most common birds alive today, this order Passeriformes, they are also then the most recent birds. And so the bird body plan has gradually been constructed over more than 150 million years with very gradual changes from the more reptilian dinosaurian form of the first birds, gradually getting to the lineages we see today. When we look at modern birds, they belong to the Cenozoic era. All right, there were no ducks or chickens or herons or woodpeckers or eagles or ostriches or songbirds in the Mesozoic era. And so birds have changed over time, and the modern types of birds they are new in Earth's history. Finally, I'd like to discuss the mammals. Now, mammals are far older than most people attribute, because most people associate mammals with the, quote, age of mammals, the Cenozoic era, which is the last 65 million years. But mammals are modified synapsid reptiles. Synapsid reptiles go back to the Carboniferous. And by the end of the Permian, synapsid reptiles were major predators on Earth. I mean, some were 20 feet long, some of the Gorgonopsids, perhaps the largest predators on Earth. Some were very large herbivores, among the largest herbivores on Earth. So synapsids were doing, wonderfully. But then the end Permian extinction occurred. And while synapsid reptiles did survive, it was nowhere near the diversity or the level of success that they had once had. The group which, the major group which survives into the Triassic period are the cynodonts. And the cynodonts became more and more mammalian. They seem to have been warm-blooded by this point, at least given the blood vessels that they had. They may have had hair, given the blood vessels which went to the whisker area of their face. When you look at their body plan, they held their bodies upright. They had lost their lumbar ribs, suggesting they had a diaphragm the way mammals do, which allowed their lungs to get longer every breath that they took. And so if you were to talk about mammal-like reptiles, the pelycosaurs of the Carboniferous and early Permian, they would have been mostly reptile. The therapsids of the Permian, even going a little into the Triassic, they would have been maybe half and half, perfectly intermediate between mammals and reptiles, where the cynodonts would be reptiles, but they would have been mostly mammalian, with far more mammalian traits than reptilian traits. And thus, somewhere in the Triassic period, cynodont reptiles evolved into mammals. Now, they were certainly not modern mammals. So, by saying that there were mammals in the Triassic, there were certainly no mice, there were no dogs or cats, there were no elephants or bears or any of the mammals alive today. And talking about Mesozoic mammals, it's certainly interesting in that mammals accomplish certainly not nothing, but close to nothing for 2/3 of their history. So if you look at the history of mammals on Earth, 2/3 of this history occurs during the Mesozoic era. Well, we associate dinosaurs and dinosaur diversity with the Mesozoic era. What did mammals do with 2/3 of their history? And the answer is, quite frankly, not a lot. There were maybe a couple that could be the size of a woodchuck or maybe a little bit bigger. A couple had minor modifications to help them dig better or to swim better. We think they were nocturnal. One was large enough and had a baby dinosaur in its gut, so maybe could prey on infant dinosaurs. But for a group of mammals which had an entire planet to experiment with over 100 million years, diversity is not that impressive. Now, there were some changes in reproduction. The first mammals, like their reptile ancestors, laid eggs. And then somewhere in the Jurassic, there were mammals which could give live birth, what we call the Therian mammals. And Therian mammals today are the marsupials and the placental mammals, or eutherian mammals. And then the by the Cretaceous period, there were the first eutherian or placental mammals. Now, they would have still been small and rodent-sized, not rodents by any means, but rodent sized by this point. Now, as I wrap this up, we're not there yet, but when I do, the reason for going through this is to kind of introduce all of some fundamentals about vertebrate ancestry, which will then serve a comparative vertebrate anatomy class, as a foundation, and the different groups of organisms, especially the different groups of mammals, become important. And so if you look here at everyone who is singing in this video, notice that everyone from the lancelet up, they were chordates. But then there were vertebrates, which would include jawless fish, but not the chordates. There were jawed vertebrates, or gnathostomes, which would include the shark and bowfin, but not the lamprey, etc. A turtle, like a crocodile, a lizard, a snake, or a bird, is an amniote. So the amniotes would include turtles, birds, crocodiles, but exclude the amphibians. But here now you can see the mammals singing. So everyone's singing, they are a mammal. And if we were, attaching names to our groupings, we could refer to this as class Mammalia. So we could say phylum Chordata, that would be everyone from this line up. So the lancelet would be the most primitive chordate. They would be in the phylum Chordata. And then a subset of the chordates would be the class Mammalia. And so here you can see the mammals. And the reason that we would classify these together is because of the traits that they share. Now, I just mention these because once again, this is the introduction for a course which covers the anatomical relationships that mammals share. But once again, if the mammal-like reptiles, the synapsids, started in the Carboniferous and then evolved into mammals by the Triassic, then we have mammals from this point on. And there was a time where we had ancestors of the three kinds of mammals alive today. The most primitive mammals alive today are the two kinds of egg-laying mammals, which we find in Australia. So the echidna, that's the spiny anteater, and the duck-billed platypus. These are mammals, but they have a number of primitive features, as we can discuss later. They still have, the reptilian trait of laying eggs. While they're warm-blooded, they're not quite as warm-blooded as the other mammals. They still have reptilian bones in their shoulder. The testes have not descended into a scrotum. They have a cloaca, which is a shared opening for the urinary, reproductive, and digestive tracts. And so at some point then we have in the Triassic, the ancestors of mammals. That would be all groups of mammals, because all of these share features. Even the egg-laying mammals have hair. Even the egg-laying mammals produce milk. Even egg-laying mammals have small blood cells which clot blood, and a complete division of the heart. So while the primitive egg-laying mammals are very different from the other groups, nevertheless, there are enough traits that they share, whether it be traits of the brain, like the enlarged cerebrum and visual cortex, to unite all of the mammals together. But once again, the most primitive mammals, and I'm sorry, somewhere. So here you can see all of the mammals, they would share the features of hair and producing milk for their young. By the Jurassic period, there was a division where there were now ancestors of both the marsupials and the placental mammals, which were now separate from the echidna and the platypus. And so these would be the live-bearing mammals, the therians. So placental mammals and marsupials, these are therian mammals. And there are traits which all of the placental or eutherian mammals share with the opossum, whether this be the live birth, whether this be the way that they establish gender. So there is a gene called the SRY gene on the Y chromosome, which establishes maleness, which the egg-laying mammals lack. And so therian mammals are a subset of mammals which exclude the egg-laying mammals. By the Cretaceous period, then the first eutherians or placental mammals. They're probably more commonly called placental mammals. Eutherians a little more proper because technically opossums, and marsupials, they do have a placenta. It's just a different kind of placenta. That could be a later discussion. So placental mammals, perhaps better stated as eutherian mammals. That would include this cat and then all of the primates. These then exist by the Cretaceous period. And they then are a group because there's a lot of things that they share, not just the idea of the fetus developing inside the mother to a more advanced state. So by comparison, kangaroos can be as large as me, but when they're born, they're the size of bees, because while kangaroos do give live birth, they don't give live birth in an advanced state. And so these eutherian mammals, they then evolve by the Cretaceous period. So the Cretaceous period then has these three types of mammals which will survive to the modern day. Now, I just want to make a couple of quick comments. Once again, these groups are not evolving in a vacuum. And so the idea that flowering plants first evolve in the Jurassic, diversified in the Cretaceous, that we certainly get very different plants in the Cenozoic era that existed in the age of dinosaurs. And so then when we look at herbivorous mammals and insectivorous rodents, certainly they're evolving in tandem. Also, the planet is changing. So if you were to look here, it was warmer than it is today. And so Florida in the southeast United States was underwater. And in fact, there was a seaway which separated portions of North America. So while it's true that Tyrannosaurus Rex lived in North America in the last 5 million years of the Cretaceous period, it was only known in this area west of this inland sea, known as Laramidia. And so the shape of the planet was certainly relevant. The Western United States was an area where there was a great deal of orogeny. This means mountain building. And so this was clearly having an impact on the world. There would be, volcanic activity. There would be uplift here. So clearly life would be impacted by that. And then even more obviously, the meteorite which fell to Earth at the end of the Cretaceous ended the reptilian rule. Now, today we observe that mammals are doing quite well. Reptiles, not so much. I mean, crocodiles can get to be big, lizards can get to be big and diverse, and as can snakes. But for the most part, mammals and birds are dominating more so than reptiles. We know that reptiles have potential for great diversity, in them, given what we see in the Mesozoic era. But the success of, say, the mammals today is helping to restrict the success of the reptiles. In the same way, during the Mesozoic, the success of the reptiles helped to restrict the mammals. But at the end Cretaceous extinction, with so many mammals so many reptiles becoming extinct, now things were changing, and now mammals could take advantage of the empty ecological niches that the extinct reptiles had left. Now, when the Cenozoic era begins, the continents are separating. So South America is finally starting to separate from Africa. Australia and Antarctica are finally separating. And India is actually moving very quickly, at least as far as continents go, towards southern Asia, where it will fuse, but not until later in the Cenozoic. So when the Cenozoic starts, India is an island. And this matters because when we look at the distribution of vertebrates today, many of them, say the lungfish or the caecilians, they're found on southern continents. The pleurodire turtles found on southern continents. And so the positions of the continents, this helps to explain the way that vertebrates are distributed throughout the world today. The egg-laying mammals today are known from Australia, but fossils are known from South America. So once again, they seem to be limited to southern continents. When the Cenozoic era starts, each continent, to a large degree, is a floating island. So India is by itself. South America has separated from Africa, but is not yet touching North America. And so what we observe in mammalian fossils is that for a long time, mammals are known only in specific parts of the world. The hoofed animals in South America will be different from the hoofed animals elsewhere. The predators in one part of the world will be different from the predators elsewhere. And so while there might be some travel, somehow, for example, monkeys get from Africa to South America, for a long time, groups of mammals tend to be endemic to one part of the world, not being, spread throughout the world. And so, elephants, are limited to Africa before they start to spread. Horses and camels are limited to North America until later in the Cenozoic when they can spread, etc. So once again, understanding the history of mammals at the beginning of the Cenozoic era, you have to understand the position of the continents. The Cenozoic era began 65 million years ago, and we split the Cenozoic era into what are called epochs. So there's a Paleocene epoch for 10 million years, and an Eocene epoch for about 20 million years. And the mammals which survived the extinction at the end of the Mesozoic tended to be small and very generalized. When they now can diversify in the Paleocene, the interesting thing is the majority of the groups of mammals are things which no longer exist today. So mammals diversify because now they have the planet to themselves. The ruling reptiles are gone, but the orders of mammals are ones which we no longer have. A shrew might be a really good representation of a primitive placental mammal. They still have a number of primitive features like a smooth cerebrum, the lack of or they have a cloaca, the testes do not descend into the scrotum, and then other traits. So while there are a couple of modern groups which are known from the Paleocene, like the very first elephants, although they weren't elephants the way we would know them, anteaters, and armadillos, rodents, and rabbits. And rabbits, while they're rodents, they're not really closely related to the other ones. They do appear in the Paleocene, but the majority of the Paleocene mammals are groups which are no longer extinct, are no longer alive today. So while the Paleocene begins the age of mammals, they're very primitive mammals. There are no primates. There are no cats, dogs, or bears. There are no hoofed, artiodactyls or perissodactyls, etc. So it would be the Eocene when a lot of these groups would exist. And there actually is a warming period, a time of global warming at the end of the Paleocene, known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So it's thought that as mammals were adapting to this new world, the change in the climate here, where it was temporarily warmer than usual, followed by a planet which starts to cool. This may have been one of the factors in the change from those old ancestral primitive mammals to the more modern lineages. Now, obviously, there are things which happen later in the Cenozoic era. Some of these are dramatic. So, for example, as Africa and Europe, moved together, separated, moved together, separated, there was a time where the Mediterranean Sea was dry land. And so Africa and Europe collided, and this would have then caused the isolation of this area. And then this, became dry land. So Africa and Europe were not separated by any water. But then about 6 million years ago, the movement of the continents then allowed the Atlantic to flow in once again, and the Mediterranean Sea formed. So obviously this would have had an enormous effect on life at that at that time. One other thing which obviously must be discussed is the ice ages. So the ice ages, they have multiple factors probably contributing. One of the things which we notice right before the ice ages begin is that the currents of the ocean were restricted. It seems that whenever water is fairly free to move and go from, say, the cold parts of the planet to the warm parts of the planet, that helps the planet distribute heat, and that prevents ice forming at the poles, and that also inhibits ice ages. But if you look at the situation which would occur as the Cenozoic progresses, as we get into the modern day, Antarctica, a landmass, sits on the South Pole. That prevents ocean currents from distributing cold water elsewhere. The North Pole is ringed by Canada, Europe, and Russia. So it's very hard for water to move as freely here. And then about 4 million years ago, North and South America, they touch a little earlier in the Cenozoic. India fused to the to Southern Asia. And so the Cenozoic begins with water being able to move freely. And at the beginning of the Cenozoic, it's warmer than it is today. And there are no, there's certainly no ice ages, and there's no ice at the poles. But following all of these changes, which restrict the movement of water around the planet. Then ice ages begin as huge ice sheets then cover and much of the land. And this has lots of effects even in the marine life because sea level changes and coral reefs move. All right, so if you look at where corals are today, as sea level goes up or down, then this causes the location of coral reefs to move. And so these changing climatic conditions, they would have had just enormous effect for vertebrates. Now, I just want to quickly overview this. I obviously have videos that go through each group, but we could look at the groups of mammals, and we slowly see the modern groups evolving. And so when the Cenozoic starts, there are no predators like we have today, no cats, dogs, bears, but there are a diverse kind of primitive predators. One group is actually more closely related to things like goats and cows, and they're more closely related to the hoofed animals of today, but that group is extinct. There was another group of predatory animals called the creodonts. They are extinct today. There were large marsupial predators. So today marsupials like opossums, they're not carnivorous, or they're not major carnivores, but there were marsupial saber-toothed cat-like forms. There were marsupial bear-like forms. And then until recently, there was the Tasmanian wolf, which only recently became extinct. And so mammals have certainly changed. So, even early in the history of the Cenozoic, there were carnivorous mammals. They would just be different from the mammals which we have today. Once again, getting back to the movement of continents, South America was isolated for so long from the other continents, only fusing with North America about 4 million years ago. When it did, this meant that the South American animals, which included these marsupials, including saber-toothed cat-like forms, bear-like forms, etc., and other predators like the giant birds, the quote terror birds, which were dominant predators in South America. They now had to compete with all of the animals which were coming south. And so things like bears and deer and camels and horses and elephants and cats and dogs, none of these had existed in South America until fairly recently. And then it was after the two continents fused that we get this great American interchange where some animals can go back and forth. So armadillos and porcupines go north, as does the opossum, but an enormous number of animals then go south. And I'm sorry, I have that a little bit here. And so when we look at the vertebrates, or at least the mammals in South America today, this geological event of the Great American Interchange had a huge impact, right? Because the native South American mammals, they all became extinct, or at least many of them did. A few kinds of South American animals did temporarily come to North America, like some giant armadillos and some giant sloths. But these South American animals now had to compete with all of the forms which were coming south. So once again, a reason to start off vertebrates history with this kind of historic overview is that the history matters, and the isolation of South America and the fusing with North America very much affects the mammal diversity on South America today. From a primitive group of what are called condylarths that existed in the Paleocene epoch, come the large herbivorous mammals, which would develop hooves on their feet. And so these condylarths descendants, we split them into the mammals which have an even number of toes, that would be the artiodactyls, or the odd number of toes, that would be the perissodactyls. So from condylarths, we get things like cows and camels and giraffes and antelope, but we also then get the odd numbered toed plant eaters like rhinos and horses. All of these evolve slowly. And so if you were to, consider horses, for example, over tens of millions of years, they go from being small leaf-eating, browsing animals to large grazing animals. Over that time, we watch their skulls adapt their teeth for eating grass, which is a hard thing to eat, given how abrasive it is. You see their toes gradually adapting for more open land, so that instead of multiple toes that allow you to jump, say, side to side, they would have a large single digit that could support the larger body's weight and allow them to run faster in one direction. Although elephants were limited to Africa for the early part of their history, elephants diversified and spread throughout the world. Tusks on elephants are just enlarged teeth, and different lineages of elephants then adapted different teeth as tusks. Some had tusks in their upper jaws, some had tusks in their lower jaws, some had tusks in both, some just had large teeth that weren't really tusks. The early elephants ate grass because they still lived in a warmer, moister world where there were more leaves and forests. So things like mastodons, they would be browsing elephants, which would eat leaves. The later groups of elephants to evolve, like mammoths and the elephants we have today, they would be grazing elephants. So here is the teeth of a mastodon. That's good for eating leaves, while the elephants of today have grazing teeth for grinding grass. Whales did not exist at the beginning of the Cenozoic. And although it is odd to think of them this way, whales are descended from terrestrial animals, and specifically the artiodactyls, those even-toed animals. Now, they split fairly early in the artiodactyl lineage, and there are a number of fossil animals, many of which lived along the Tethys Seaway before Africa and Europe fused and before India fused to Asia. There was a seaway between the north and the south, and there were these animals which would be the ancestors of whales. And then over time, the limbs would gradually get reduced. So there are a number of swimming whales which have all four legs. There are whales which still have remnants of their hind legs, like Basilosaurus. And so just as the traits of birds and all of these other animals very slowly develop, the same would be true of whales. Okay. Now, I'd like to end by specifically talking about the lineages of humans, especially since in my classes, these are terms which we use a great deal. Like we'll talk about primates, we'll talk about anthropoid primates and apes. So just to put these terms in context. None of the mammals we have alive today were alive in the Mesozoic. So the Mesozoic had mammals, but there were none of our modern mammals. When the Cenozoic era started, there were no primates. And in the Paleocene, while there were no primates, there was the sister group of the primates, their relatives, called Plesiadapiforms. And so these Plesiadapiforms had some, but not all of the features which we use to define the primates. Now, here I once again have this series where little groups sing, and then they go through the traits that they have in common. So if you were to think back to, say grade school or high school, maybe you had to memorize, this taxonomic grouping of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Obviously, as you've seen in these 3 videos, there's lots of subgroups. We could have, subphylum, we could have infraclass, superclass, subclass, so we can subdivide this, and after a certain while, which groups we pick, depending on what we want to say. But let's just, kind of stick with that a set of terms that you might be familiar with. So the class Mammalia, and once again, all, the echidna, the opossum, and the cat, they would all be in the class Mammalia. They would, then be divided into subgroups. And at some level, we would have what we call orders. So rodents would be an order, the order Rodentia. Cats would belong in the order Carnivora. Elephants are an order, etc. Well, primates are an order, and so all of these animals here, they would be primates, and that would include even lemurs, and they would share anatomical features. Sorry, just my foot's going to sleep. They would have forward-facing eyes. They would have a post-orbital bar protecting their eyes, and more traits which we can go through later. Obviously, I have videos which go through this. So there's skeletal, there's nervous system, traits all over the body which define the primates, and that would include not only humans but also more primitive primates such as the lemurs, which you can find in Madagascar, or other primitive primates like the loris, which you can find in South Asia. The first primates are known from the beginning of the Eocene. By the end of the Eocene, there are anthropoid primates. Anthropoid primates would include everyone in yellow here, the South American monkey, the monkey from Africa or Asia, and then all of the apes, but would exclude things like the lemur, the loris, the pato, the ai. So there are primitive primates which are not anthropoid primates. The first anthropoid primates, they appear by the end of the Eocene. By the next epoch, the Oligocene, there are what are known as the Old World monkeys and apes, the catarrhine primates. So catarrhine primates include the monkeys of Africa and Asia, and one of the monkeys can also occur in Gibraltar, so technically then Europe as well. But would exclude South American monkeys. So the Old World monkeys and the apes, they are catarrhine primates. And catarrhine primates, then they share features and a more recent common ancestor than they share with these other primates here. And I go through it like the loss of the vomeronasal organ, the reduced sense of smell, the color vision, which now all of them possess. So these catarrhine primates are depending more on vision and color vision than we had seen in the earlier primates. So I have a couple of videos on that. By the Miocene epoch, and now we are in the second half of the Cenozoic era. By the Miocene, you have the first apes. And what defines an ape is then the loss of the tail, all right? And so then this will allow the apes to be upright. At first, more of a hanging upright, because now, they can support the organs of their pelvic cavity. But later apes will actually then include apes which walk upright as we do. See, monkeys can't walk upright in that sense because they don't have any support for urinary and pelvic organs, and then this could be a problem if they got to be big or and thus heavy. Gravity would pull on these important organs to a greater degree. But as the apes first evolved in the Miocene, they lost these external tails, and the tail muscles that they had now reinforced the body wall so that they could be upright like this gibbon. Here you see a gorilla climbing up the tree. And gorilla is obviously larger than any monkey alive today. Here you'll see another gibbon coming by in just a second. And notice that apes can now walk upright in a way that monkeys don't. Okay, so apes are known as of the Miocene. And there are lots of different kinds of gibbon. These are the most primitive apes. There is then, as apes diversified and spread throughout the world, there was a lineage of higher apes, which gibbons do not belong to. But this set of higher apes would include orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans. And the name, other than higher apes, we could call this the family Hominidae. All right. So when we talk about a family, the suffix tends to be DAE, whereas a subfamily, as you'll see in the next video, the suffix is NAE. So if we were to think about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, humans belong to the family Hominidae, and that would include orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans. We are more closely related to each other in this family than we are to any organisms outside this family. So these higher apes spread throughout the world, and while some become extinct, including the giant Gigantopithecus, orangutans are still alive. Then within that family Hominidae comes the subfamily Homininae. That would exclude orangutans, Gigantopithecus, and many other forms which are extinct, but it would include gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. So these three are in the same subfamily. Now, we think that the human lineage split from that of gorillas maybe about 9 million years ago. And we think that the human lineage separated from chimpanzees, maybe around 7 million years ago, 5 to 7. I think it's a little closer to 7. And so then from that point, say from that 5 to 7 million years ago point, there were apes, which were the ancestors of humans and their extinct relatives, but no other modern organism, because the lineages of gorillas and chimpanzees had diverged by that point. There are some fossils which we know of in the period of, say, from 7 million years ago to, say, 4 million years ago, which seem to be members of that early group right after the human lineage diverged from that of gorillas and chimps. This would include Sahelanthropus, Auroran, and some species of Ardipithecus. All showed some similarities with humans that other apes lack, and some modifications for upright walking. So they were nowhere near as good at upright walking as the groups would be in the future, but nevertheless, they are better than apes, or than gorillas or chimps. Okay. Now, if we were to ask a chimpanzee to throw its head against a wall, all right, what we would see is that modern chimpanzees have a brain volume in this, 400 to 500 100 up to 600 cc's, or cubic centimeters. And the modern human range is up here in blue. So as you can see, there's a big difference in brain size between chimps and humans. If you were to ask, all right, as we start going into, whether it be the species I just mentioned or the next group, which we call the Australopithecines, how do they fare? And the answer is, for a long time, the cranial volume is within chimp range. So even in things like Ardipithecus or the Australopithecines, which we will see presently, they are undergoing adaptations for upright walking. The brain size was still small. And so as we look at those changes, which allowed humans to become humans, upright walking came first, and then the increase in cranial volume came later. Now, for a very long time, we are talking about Africa only. So if you remember, previously when I talked about the biogeography of mammals, elephants spread throughout the world. I mean, there were mastodons in North America, even going down to South America prior to the ice ages, or I'm sorry, around that time. And while humans would spread throughout the world, all of the earliest lineages are known in Africa only. So we don't find any member of our lineage outside Africa until about 2 million years ago. So, if we're starting at 5 to 7 million years ago, this means, millions of years of, the origin of human lineages known in Africa only. So that is the place where our lineage owes its origin. And there was a group known as the Australopithecines, which for the most part did not have an enlarged brain, although some of the robust ones actually were a little larger than chimps. But they did have adaptations for upright walking. The hole in their head where the spinal cord enters the brain meant that the spinal cord entered directly instead of coming in at an angle. But then if you look at their, the vertebrae, their toes, their hips, all over the body, these Australopithecines, they were upright walkers, but their cranial volume had not yet increased. The first Australopithecines known from, say, 4.4 million years ago. And then going even after the genus Homo appears, it may even be that Homo helped to do in the last of the Australopithecines. But if we look at some of these Australopithecines, including the Lucy species, which is so well studied, the brain size is still within chimp range, maybe a slightly bigger than your average chimp. So once again, it would be the adaptations for upright walking, which would be so significant at first, not the increase in brain size. Now, while the Australopithecines were better at bipedal locomotion than the previous group, like Ardipithecus, and Ardipithecus was better than a chimp, they are nowhere near as good at bipedal locomotion as we would see later in, say, Homo erectus. So adapting to bipedal locomotion was a gradual process which took millions of years. Once again, Australopithecines better than the previous groups, but not as good as, say, Homo erectus. Homo habilis was the first member of the genus Homo, and their brain was now larger than chimpanzees, but they still weren't very good at running. Running would come about with Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus, if we look at these individuals, they would have about our body proportions. So this would be then for the first time. All right, so they had a change in the center of gravity, and they probably would have been able to undergo endurance running for the first time. Even the most primitive members of Homo habilis, would not have been able to run up or to do endurance running the way we see with Homo erectus. So Homo habilis first appears 2.5 million years ago, Homo erectus a little younger than 2 million years ago. But now we have individuals that look very much like us from the neck down. Their skulls are big. They have big brains. Now it would increase over time, smaller at first and within normal human range at the end of Homo erectus. But when we look at the shape of the skull, most of the early human species couldn't do this. They didn't have a forehead the way I do, or this gentleman on the right has. And so they would have had a much lower skull, which would have been longer with a heavy brow ridge. And so even as brain volume was increasing, you could see, very obviously the shape of the skull was different. There would have been a larger brow ridge and a skull which was low but long, as opposed to modern Homo sapiens, where the skull is shorter but more rounded. Okay, and so Homo evolved in stages. And so cranial volume in Homo erectus would change. The very earliest Homo erectus, like the skull on the left there, while the average Homo erectus skull is 950, all right, which is just below modern human range. The first Homo erectus skulls would have smaller cranial volumes. So they would be larger than chimps, all right, but smaller than modern humans. And so Homo erectus was around for almost 2 million years, over 1.5 million years, and their skulls got bigger over time with a larger cranial volume. Now, as Homo erectus spread throughout the planet, there were multiple species of Homo which evolved, including a dwarf species where adults would stand maybe only 3 feet tall, that lived on the island of Flores in Indonesia. So this species of human here is known as Homo floresiensis. So just as we, could see in any group, there was diversification throughout the world with multiple species appearing. The same thing would then be true in modern humans. And then we get to, the interesting question: what then happened between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago with Homo sapiens? So, as I've talked about all of this, this time lapse, the genus Homo first appears 2.5 million years ago. But our species, Homo sapiens, for the first time, we're looking at between 2 and 300,000 million years ago. And Homo sapiens lives in Africa only for at least half of its history. But then, in addition to traveling throughout Africa, Homo sapiens then travels to Europe and to Asia. And what happens? Well, so here's a question. There were already other species of humans living there. Homo sapiens was not the only species of Homo that was known in Africa. So if Homo sapiens encountered another African species, what would have happened? Well, the idea of replacement is that the other species just died or got wiped out or something. And so that Homo sapiens would be the one and only ancestor of then all humans who trace their origin to Africa. In contrast, the idea of regional continuity is that maybe some of these groups, intermarried. And so that modern Africans then might then have ancestry not just from Homo sapiens, which first appeared 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, but also then from multiple groups. Now, that's hard to test because there are only 3 species of Homo whose DNA is known. Homo sapiens, and then one that lived primarily in Europe and one that lived in Asia, which I'm about to get to. And so that question that I just raised is more easily tested for the Asians and the Europeans than the Africans until, there was some sort of a fossil find that would have DNA from another species. Those same questions could then be asked of both Asia and Europe. Where do modern Asians come from? Well, obviously, Homo sapiens, which left Africa, some groups, to go to Asia about 70 to 100,000 years ago. Probably 100,000 years ago, but the initial colonization of the Middle East may not have been successful, so maybe more than 70,000 a year ago migration. Homo sapiens obviously, provided ancestry to modern Asians. But when Homo sapiens got to Asia, there was other species of humans already living there. All right, Homo erectus was there, Homo floresiensis was there, the Denisovans were there. So what happened? Well, if the replacement model is true, then Homo sapiens prevailed, these other groups died out, and Asians are 100% descended from Homo sapiens, which got to Asia maybe 70,000 years ago. But if there was intermarriage and interbreeding between the two, the new Homo sapiens and the older populations which were already there, that would mean that Asians would then have some of their ancestry from Homo sapiens and some from these other lineages. And then we could ask the same questions of Europeans. Where do Europeans come from? Well, Homo sapiens reaches Europe from Asia maybe 40,000 years ago. There were at least another species, at least the Neanderthals, where there other species had been there earlier in European history. And so what happened? Well, maybe, Neanderthals and, any remnants of previous species died so that only Homo sapiens prevailed. Okay, or maybe that idea of regional continuity held in here as well, where there was some interbreeding, say, between the Homo sapiens, which reached Europe from Asia 40,000 years ago, and the older populations of humans which were already there, the Neanderthals. Now, what I just said, fascinating topic, and I have lots of videos on the topic, but just to jump to the punchline. So we only have 3 types of human species DNA that we can use for comparison. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, who lived in Central Asia, and then Homo sapiens. Modern Africans have only the DNA associated with Homo sapiens. But Europeans typically have 1 to 2% of their DNA as being Neanderthal. So if you look here, in red, that's 98% would have come from the Homo sapiens, which left Africa. But 2% of their DNA suggests that there was interbreeding with Neanderthal populations. I've done the 23andMe count, and I actually have a bit more Neanderthal DNA than is typical. So, my ancestors were primarily Homo sapiens, but I have some Neanderthal in my ancestry as well. When we consider Asians, Asians typically maybe have 1, maybe 2, but more closer probably to 1% of their DNA as Neanderthal. But there was another species of humans known as the Denisovans living in Central Asia. And some Asians may have 1% of their DNA coming from the Denisovans, but there are some Asian populations, say, inhabitants of say, New Guinea or the native Australians, for example. They might have 5 to 8% of their DNA from the Denisovans. So at least some interbreeding between these populations certainly did occur. Now, there are so many other topics which are fascinating, but for the introduction I'm trying to give, they would be tangents, such as more about the ice ages. One other thing is, as we look at vertebrates, just a fact of life is, I had mentioned that there were mass extinctions in Earth's history. Well, tragically, we're living in one. And it, while there are certainly, climate changes between the end of the Ice Age and the modern climate change, it is human activity which is causing one of the worst periods of extinction in Earth's history. So starting with the success of Homo sapiens spreading throughout the world, many species native to an area tend to become extinct when humans get there. So much so that some people would like to define a new geologic period, the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, as the most recent time period because of the enormous effect that humans are having. All right, and so, while it's impressive that we're smart enough to affect the planet at that scale, unfortunately a lot of this effect is negative for life on Earth. The climate change that we're causing, the extinctions. When you think about how much we've modified landscapes, how much of the landscape is now used for our crops or our livestock. The livestock to feed humanity outweighs all wild mammals. All right, if you were to put all livestock on a scale and all wild mammals on a scale, the human livestock exceeds that. And so certainly we have this incredible impact on the world. But to wrap up, let me just kind of get back to the reason for this introduction. So history matters. So for example, the reason we study world history or American history is like the events of 1776 or the 1860s. They impact the modern day. The modern day would be different if it wasn't for those events. Biologically speaking, history matters. When we look at the history of life on Earth, there was movement of continents, there were mass extinctions, there were the evolution of new groups, of flowering plants, of amniotes, etc. And this would have a drastic effect on other species. Lots of organisms are only known from specific blocks of time, just like the Egyptian pharaohs are known from only certain parts of world history. And George Washington and the colonial army are only known from another part of the Earth's history. So too are the placoderm fish, or the synapsid reptiles, or the plesiadapiform cousins of primates, etc. As we consider the vertebrate body, or specifically the human body, it has developed over hundreds of millions of years. All right, so some parts of our anatomy, the initial structures were established going back to early animals in the Ediacaran. Other features were established by the early vertebrates of the Cambrian, or the early jawed vertebrates of the Ordovician, the early bony vertebrates of the Silurian, the first amphibians of the Devonian, the first amniotes of the Carboniferous, the mammals, the Therian mammals, and the Eutherian mammals of the Mesozoic era, or the primates, or later the anthropoid primates, catarrhine primates, apes, etc., of the Cenozoic era. And so as we identify groups of vertebrates, that idea of progression through time is important. And hopefully you noticed that if you were to think of the groups, all right, the big groups are the ones which originate earlier. So if you look at the groups like the vertebrates, or if that's a big group, all right. If you look then at groups like the jawed vertebrates, the gnathostomes, that is a subgroup, all right, and then they appear later than that. The amniotes later than that. And so if we were to then go through time, all right, you would see that progression of groups, so that the larger groups start off earlier, followed by the later groups. So a couple of examples. So if you were to look at, say, bass, they are osteichthyans, which have their originate then. They are actinopterygians, which originate there. They are neopterygians. So all of these are groups to which bass belong. But if you get to members of their genus, and then specifically the bass species, they occur only very recently. So as you go from the big groupings to the small groupings, you're going from farther back in geologic time to far more recently. Then the same would be true of tree frogs. If you were to look, say, at the groups which belong to tree frogs, they evolved slowly over time, with big groups occurring farther back in time, the genus being fairly recent and the species even more recent. If we were to apply this to humans, we can put ourselves in a whole assortment of living things. So we're alive. That means we're descended from the first living things, that go back to the Archean eon. But then again, we are eukaryotes, given the nuclei in our cells, etc. Eukaryotes first arise in the Proterozoic eon from about 2 billion years ago. So we are eukaryotes, and that's a smaller group than the group of living things, and that has a more recent origin. We put ourselves in the kingdom Animalia. And then the kingdom Animalia, that comes from the later Proterozoic. And then there are subsets of animals. So there are metazoan animals with nervous system. There are bilaterally symmetric animals like worms, etc. So then they would be smaller and smaller divisions. Now, if I were to take this Phanerozoic eon here, the last 500 million years, this region in purple, and now expand that, so that'll take up the entire screen. All right, so instead of trying to depict all of the eons, I'm just going to depict that one eon. We would see then the Phanerozoic eon could be split into those 3 eras: the Paleozoic era for the old life, the Mesozoic era for middle life, and the Cenozoic era for recent life. We could split these into periods. And this is when we would see the chordates, and humans belong to the phylum Chordata. The phylum Chordata first evolves in the Cambrian, although maybe at the end of the Ediacaran, there were some chordates as well. The first vertebrate fish are known from the Cambrian, and the primitive vertebrates like lampreys and hagfish, they descended from that lineage. Jawed vertebrates first appear somewhere between the Ordovician and the Silurian. Sharks, were a side branch from that period. Then there are osteichthyans, the bony fish, and the sarcopterygian osteichthyans like lungfish and coelacanths, which are coming from the Silurian into the Devonian. The first vertebrates on land evolve at the end of the Devonian, so these are the first tetrapods, and amphibians are descended from this lineage. Amniotes appear in the Carboniferous period, and the various reptiles and birds separate from the human lineage at this point. Mammals in the Triassic, the echidna and platypus lineages separate from ours at this point. Therian mammals evolve in the Jurassic, so their lineage separates from ours at that point. And then the various eutherians first appear at the Cretaceous period. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, the eutherians greatly diversify to occupy the time, the ecological niches which dinosaurs have laid vacant. So let's take the Cenozoic era, the last 65 million years, and now let's look at its epochs, all right? And so we can see that while there were multiple lineages of eutherians diversifying in the Paleocene and other times, that primates would have their origin at the beginning of the Eocene. So we are in the order primates. Anthropoid primates would appear by the end of the Eocene. Catarrhine primates would appear in the Oligocene. Apes would appear at the beginning of the Miocene, and then later in the Miocene epoch, we would get our family, the family Hominidae. We would get our subfamily, the subfamily Homininae. Then there's a lineage, including the Australopithecines from 5 to 7 million years ago, which only have us as their living descendants. The first members of the genus Homo, that's a genus, we belong to the genus Homo, appeared 2.5 million years ago. And then our species, Homo sapiens, first appears between 200 and 300,000 years ago. So if you think about those groups, once again, as you go from big to small, say kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, you're also progressing in time with these smaller groups being more recent than those older groups. So what I hoped to do is to just kind of give an overview of the history of vertebrates, so that this classification scheme and some of their history would serve as a foundation for later studies. And I have lots of videos from my comparative vertebrate anatomy classes on the anatomy of the different systems.